Hi, folks who are still joining us. We're going to have just get going in a couple more minutes. You'll now see that the call is being recorded. So if you could just hit that little OK on your screen. And the reason we do this is so we can post questions to YouTube, post the webinar to YouTube and send it out to folks who couldn't come after. So if you want to turn off your camera, or if you have questions and don't want to kind of come on live to ask them, feel free to use the chat to ask them. And we'll go over all this again, but Steph, known as Stephanie Kelly as her Zoom name, is a good person to message questions to. But yeah, we'll make sure that your questions can get asked, even if you don't want to kind of speak to them yourselves. And we are just seeing kind of our number of people on the call shoot up a bit. So we're going to wait just a couple more minutes before we get going. Thanks, everyone.
Alex, do you see the blocks that are blocking your first slide?
Yep, those are just the chat box, so I can chat with folks until we get started.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. So we're just going to kind of repeat our housekeeping again for the folks who are still coming in. And then after that, we'll get going. So thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight at our Conservation Matters monthly webinar by Hamilton 350. The 350 team, I think we're really excited about this one. We're going to have a bit of an engagement piece, which isn't something we've had in our webinars before. We have such exciting guests like Phil Podden from Environmental Defense, Zane Bassett from Halton Conservation. We also have video clips from Grand River Conservation Authority. We're really just excited to kind of talk to you all about what we've been up to for this past year and what some of these changes coming down the line from the Ford government will mean for us all in this year ahead. So before we get started, just some Zoom basics. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see things like a mute, a share video, a stop video. If you want to be muted, that would be a lot better for all of us. In fact, our co-hosts will be muting folks. We'll have time to speak, as I kind of said. We'll be doing some breakout rooms at the end. We'll also have a question period. So there will be a chance to be heard, and the chat is going the whole time. So if you have questions or want to make a comment or introduce yourself, we'd really encourage folks to use the chat. And yeah, before we get too far into it, I just want to make sure if some folks could, put a thumbs up in the chat to make sure they can hear me and all the audio is good to go on their end.
The only issue I can see, Alex, is that your slides are we're seeing the presenter's view.
Yes. Yeah, so we'll go full screen in a second. Oh, perfect. Thanks for that, Katie. And Stan, nice to see you here. It's always nice to, when you bump into a neighbor online, it's always exciting. So yeah, it's 7:06. We have, folks are still coming on, but let's get going. So Dawn, if you wanted to unmute and come on out, why don't we get this show going? So as we said, this is being recorded. It's just so we can post this resource for folks who couldn't make it. But yeah, we're excited to start. So as we said, tonight's webinar is The Future of Conservation, and it's just the next installment of our series, Conservation Matters.
Also talks about Eastman working with state legislators in the states on quote unquote election integrity stuff.
Is someone able to just mute?
Yeah.
Thank you. And yeah, let's get going. So I'm going to invite Dawn on in a second to kind of talk a little bit more about why we're here, but you folks may remember these headlines from about a year ago, December of 2020, when we started hearing about the Ford government stripping powers of conservation authorities, a series of mass resignations, and conservation authorities were really in the news. And what happened was that through Bill 229, which is something passed by the Ford Conservative government in the province of Ontario, there was a mandate change or a proposed mandate change to conservation authorities. And this got a lot of folks up in arms, and it really acted as kind of almost an instigation point for us at Hamilton 350 to get organizing and to start looking at conservation authorities as a place where power can happen and power, plays out. Because if the Ford government was putting their attention there, that was a pretty good indicator that we as conservationists, as environmentalists, as people who really care about the climate crisis and want to see climate action should also be turning our attention to conservation authorities. And so now we're having this webinar today because almost a year after these changes were first announced, a lot of the legislation was written to be determined by regulation. So that's when they say, oh, this is what the law is, but this definition or defining what a core mandate is will be determined by this working group and added to the law later. So we're going to talk a little bit more, but those regulations are now out and we can kind of see the full picture of the changes that first started a year ago and have now continued out to today. So yeah, Dawn, I don't know if you want to kind of introduce CA Watch, the conservation group of 350, and some of the stuff that we've been up to. That's okay. If you need a sec, Dawn, we're not hearing you.
So unmute. I'm unmuted now. Okay. Thanks so much, Alex, for introducing me. One of the things that we've been doing at Hamilton 350 in response to the changes that the provincial government has imposed is we started a conservation watch. So that means that we are, as volunteers, observing the board meetings of local conservation authorities. We have 5 or 6 that we're watching at this point. We take notes on those. And you see here in these webinars, some of the things that we find out by watching these organizations and seeing what they're up to and seeing what the implications are of the changes which the Ford government has imposed. So there's lots of local grassroots groups in Hamilton that are participating in this. We've done a number of these webinars. We've worked with organizations across the province who are facing similar problems with the Ford government. Part of those are ministerial zoning orders, such as was imposed on the Pickering Ajax area to destroy a provincially significant wetland, which was saved by public opposition and by the fact that it came out that Amazon was going to be the owner of the warehouse that the developers wanted to put on that wetland, and then they ran for cover. We also helped folks that did some focus on the efforts of Stratford residents, successful again, to block a ministerial zoning order that would have imposed a very large increase in greenhouse gas emissions on their community from a factory that was going to be built on the edge of the community on farmland. And it was all secret until the last minute. And we've been doing lots of things in the Hamilton area as well, particularly around the urban boundary expansion and with respect to the proposals to take 3,300 acres of prime farmland and convert them to subdivisions. A battle that is continuing and will come to something of a head early in November at a meeting on November 9th.
Yeah, and Dawn, I think there's two things all of these photos have in common, or maybe three soon. But the provincial governments had a hand in pushing all these developments or pushing all of these policy changes. And we at the 350 team have also, been using our webinars to kind of push back as well. So it's really been over the past year, we've been helping folks out who are fighting the province directly or getting engaged in all these local struggles, but they paint a picture about what this government's priorities are. And now when we kind of look at conservation authorities and our kind of second initiative, Conservation Watch, it's been a real, we've been able to tune into some development proposals, as you mentioned, like locally. I know one of the ones where we were able to have a local win was by sending watchers to the Hamilton Conservation Authority. We were able to get kind of the heads up that there was a proposal from a developer to pave over a wetland that just wasn't on the province's books and wasn't technically on the city's books. And then we were able to help fix that. But we, were able to rally folks. We had over 200 letters sent to the Conservation Authority. We said, you can't replace this wetland with a warehouse. Their proposal was to offset it by building a kind of a small stormwater pond on site. Our community was really able to rally and say, that's not sufficient. And by doing that, we also saw that if there wasn't so much public input, we even heard one of the councillors on the Conservation Authority say, I would have voted with you, but it's clear you've lost the PR battle on this one, which was a really big red flag for us at the meeting, who are watching that, because no one's often there and because maybe folks aren't watching. Some of the conversations, the guard is down a little bit, and it's clear kind of who's talking to who or kind of what agreements are being made. So that kind of brings us to what are conservation authorities. It's at the center of these new provincial announcements. It's at the center of a lot of the work we've been doing. Dawn, what is a conservation authority?
Conservation authorities are an Ontario innovation that goes back to the end of the Second World War, particularly developed in the 1950s after Hurricane Hazel, and now covering the entire Southern Ontario, as you see it in the map there. There are 36 of them, and they are organized on the basis of watersheds. So they take care of watersheds, and they overlap many times numerous municipalities. They're not a political structure, they are a watershed-based structure, so they're environmentally based. Their main function initially was to prevent flooding or minimize flooding, erosion, to control the damages that might arise as a result of a storm like Hurricane Hazel. They employ teams of conservationists, scientists, educators. They run camping programs. They run educational programs. They are the advisors and the overseers of development applications that take place in the municipalities that are then examined by the experts at the Conservation Authority for what their ecological implications are. They also have permitting rules that have been restricted by the changes in the legislation that were brought in late last year in December 2019.
Yeah, thank you for that. And we're watching the Niagara, the Hamilton, the Grand River, the Halton, and the Credit Valley. And that's just like, I believe under 10 volunteers at this point are able to watch these 5 conservation authorities. Just let us know like what's going on. A lot of these conservation authorities do post their board meetings to YouTube already. Some of them don't, and that's been a bit of an issue for us, but they're, even if it's available to the public, if no one's watching, what good is it? Or if no one's kind of conveying that information. So we're really excited to be there, but we really want to make this plug. If you are on this call tonight and don't live in one of these 5 conservation authorities, we would love to talk to you about what it means to kind of just watch a conservation authority. You get so much more informed about what's going on in your local area. And it's generally just a couple of hours a month in terms of commitment. So it's not too bad. So if that's something you might be interested in doing, please post that in the chat and I'm sure we'll have someone follow up with you. And so to kind of talk a little bit about this program, is you can kind of see what we've been up to this past year before we go into what Dick Ford's been up to this past year. We have one of our citizen watchers right now to talk to us about kind of her experience watching the most recent Grand River Conservation Authority. But yeah, I just want to reiterate that, when the province was trying to kind of looking at the conservation authorities, and they a year ago said they were going to remove citizens from the boards, we knew that was a good call to say, oh, citizens really need to be there. The second, our premier is trying to get rid of citizens in a place, that's where our eyes should be. So Carol, what's it like watching a conservation authority, and what happened at Grand River on September?
I'm sorry, Carol Ann, I just muted you without realizing you were about to speak, so we can't hear you right now.
Okay, I'll unmute myself.
Sorry.
Hi, folks. The Grand River Conservation Area manages water and other natural resources on behalf of 39 municipalities and close to 1 million residents of the Grand River watershed. They're headquartered in Cambridge, and they are the oldest water management agency in Canada and one of the oldest in the world. Their size is very large, 6,800 kilometers, or the size of Prince Edward Island. So here we have an event reported on, it happened, the event, sorry, on the 22nd to the 23rd of September, just last month, a flood event. And the director of engineering, Dwight Boyd, described the extreme weather event on September the 22nd, 23rd, where 120 millimeters of rainfall fell over a 24-hour period, with 1/3 of the rainfall falling in the last 4 hours of the storm. It was large, widespread, over 24 hours, basically a conveyor belt. That a system such as that had been set up from moisture from actually the Atlantic Ocean crossing the USA and moving across southwestern Ontario. 60 to 70 millimeters of rain fell by noon on the 23rd of September, but in just the last 4 hours that evening, an additional 30 to 40 millimeters fell. So it created a rapid response flow in 2 rivers, 2 creeks. The flooding impact affected Drayton, Wellesley, New Hamburg, Ayr, and the city of Kitchener. And they hadn't seen a storm like that happen in 35 years. Not a storm of this magnitude, not since 1986. The really high level event was at the Wellesley Dam, where the rapid response team was called in to stabilize and open the gates. The dam was within 2 to 3 inches of breaching the sides. Another uncommon event that happened on this day, the tiles of Waterloo, quite a large city now, town square, were lifted due to flooding. And from my colleague Marie, she caught that the mayor felt vindicated, the mayor of Waterloo, that she had refused building requests in that area and the adjoining parking lot, also in floodplain. They had to debrief it. They had to share the experience with staff to help them adapt to what was going on, and they had to debrief on an ongoing basis. Second slide, thank you. So communication then becomes a real issue during events like this. And this specific weather event and the activities that follow it really do highlight the work of the Grand River Conservation Area managing dams and reservoirs. It's a good example of hazard management. It's an excellent story about the continued hard work with which the staff of our conservation areas carry out their tasks across all of our watersheds. And my last comment here, then, I've learned a lot from this event. As a whole, extreme weather events are becoming more frequent with climate change, and this should not simply be a local responsibility. This, in fact, must be very much a provincial responsibility to attend to climate change and these issues. And that's where I'm at. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Carolyn, because I think you're right. It really does underscore that, we go, oh, what's a conservation authority, or what does a conservation authority do? And a lot of us maybe over the pandemic have gotten out into our local conservation authority, have seen the recreation side of things, maybe got to appreciate the trails, learned a little bit about what's going on, but there is a huge climate role here. And it's one that the provincial government's certainly not talking about. The media coverage of what's going on hasn't really been talking about this climate angle as much as we'd like either. That what happens when there's floods, if these are flood management institutions, and this is where our provincial government is kind of pointing fingers or poking their nose in, what does that mean? This is a government that frequently cuts money. They cut from the flooding budget and the forest fire budget in their first budget. So what does that look like, and what's that impact going to be? And that kind of brings us to these changes. And Dawn's going to help walk us through kind of what the timeline of changes to conservation authorities have been to really underscore what's going on to our conservation authorities. Dawn?
Thanks, Alex. This story goes back to shortly after the current provincial government got elected. They didn't mention that they were going to do anything to the conservation authorities, but they started in 2019 issuing warnings to the CAs that they should get out of non-mandatory programs. In December, the legislation we talked about was adopted in late December, and it imposed a number of changes. There was huge opposition. 45,000 people sent emails to the provincial government. Over 40 municipalities sent letters of opposition, and all 36 conservation authorities were opposed. Some of those changes were imposed immediately, and you're probably aware of them if you've been watching earlier webinars. A major one was that whenever the province decides that it wants to impose a development without any public consultation and any normal rules applied, that through a ministerial zoning order, that the conservation authorities were legislated to require them to grant permits, even though these things would be damaging. And at the end of the day, the conservation authorities themselves might get sued for approving something or permitting something that ended up in a disastrous state. There was also the elimination of most citizen members of the conservation authorities, and those changes were imposed immediately after the legislation. But there was additional stuff coming down the tubes, and that was particularly the thing that we want to focus on tonight, which is the changes to the mandate of the conservation authorities and what that means for us locally. So in 2021, late 2020, an advisory committee was established to consider what regulations might be imposed on the conservation authorities about their core mandate. The core mandate generally has been defined now as limited to flooding, erosion, managing existing lands, fairly narrow mandate, and excludes a whole lot of what the conservation authority does. And it means that everything else that they do is in financial jeopardy. So programs that are not in the core mandate are no longer automatically funded through the annual budget
allocations of the municipalities that fall within that conservation authority. Now, each of those programs, if it needs money, that has to be extracted on a program by program basis and a council by council basis, requiring special agreements, memorandums of understanding in order to get that funding. The province itself is not doing much funding. In most conservation authorities, it's very minimal. And the ones around Hamilton, less than 5% of current funding. And there was no new money offered here, although there were a string of new requirements for reports to the province and extensive information that had to be put together, so much so that eventually it was the actual requirement to provide that information got delayed for an extra year and now is due in early 2024. So the kinds of things that conservation authorities do, in which most people see a conservation authority involved in, are things that are now not part of the core mandate. They are non-mandatory, and the conservation authority either has to find its own funding for those or has to make special agreements with each of the municipalities in its watershed. This includes climate programs, ecological restoration, tree planting and forest management is not considered mandatory. Wetland enhancement and restoration is not there. Natural heritage planning, and this is a big one because the conservation authorities have generally been asked by municipalities to review development applications and flag problems with them and identify what things should go ahead and what things shouldn't go ahead because of their ecological implications. And the municipalities have relied on the conservation authorities to identify which parts of our natural areas are most significant and should definitely be protected from any kind of development. Other things that the conservation authorities do, but are not considered mandatory now, include invasive species management, educational programs, land purchases. There's no money coming from the province for that, non-mandatory research, and there's actually a fair threat to the recreation category as well. And maybe you can go to the next slide for that a bit. I'm not sure whether we've got that there.
Yeah, Don, why don't you talk us through what's going on with recreation?
Okay, so what happened on recreation is this really raised some hackles in the Grand River material that we're going to be showing you, where it became clear that if you wanted to manage a trail and it went through several municipalities, you had to sign several agreements with several different municipalities, and any one of them could say, no, we're not going to fund that anymore. And then you don't have a trail anymore. You've got a big gap in the trail. Recreational programs are really central to what the public sees conservation authorities providing, and it's major service. So at the end of the day, after significant discussion within the advisory committee and pushback from the conservation authority boards, the province agreed to include passive recreation in the mandatory services. But it turns out, it appears that the passive recreation is very loosely defined as things that you don't spend any money on. So if there's no staff involved in your passive recreation programs, if there's nobody there running a trail center, then it's okay to include that as your part of your mandatory programs. But if you've got to use staff for that, if you've got to spend money on it, it falls down as a non-mandatory activity and you have to find money for it somewhere else.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dawn. And like the big change here is really this kind of like 3 buckets of funding, or basically all programs kind of have to go into one of these 3 funding paths now. And the first being mandatory, which, you know, there's no new money, but might get some provincial funding. And then the other options are either self-funded. So that means generally fees for service. So if you want to use it, there may be parking fees or other things that pay for it, or funded by the municipalities. And you know, maybe folks online are going, okay, this seems like a really minor change, or like this seems so like, you know, policy based, like what's the big deal, or like, why should I care? And I think beyond the fact that these things are being put at risk, we're going to hear from Sue, another one of our CA Watch volunteers, about just like how conservation authorities were kind of involved in this change, because I think that's a big part of this as well, and what their reaction was. So yeah. Sue's an avid user of conservation authorities, as we can see. From your experience as a CA watcher, how are conservation authorities reacting?
Yeah, so you can see I'm in Hamilton and in Halton conservation areas here. We were actually checking for the salmon jumping last year. So I'm really lucky. I live in the Dundas Valley. I use the trails daily. Since March, I've listened to several CA board meetings from the 5 groups that we have undertaken to watch. I found the meetings incredibly informative. I had no idea of all the work that the CAs undertake. The staff reports are very interesting, and they cover wide ranges of topics from wells and water levels in the lakes and rivers and tree cannabis and invasive species. The clip that we're going to show in a few minutes is from the June meeting of the Grand River Association, but it's representative of similar concerns and frustrations that I've seen at other CA board meetings. You'll see Chris White in the top second left-hand corner square. He's the chair of the board, and he's also a municipal councillor in the area. He does most of the talking, but you'll hear other members of the board expressing concerns about various things that we've discussed. The Grand River has an even more difficult job than some other CAs because it covers 39 different municipalities. So agreements need to be reached with all of those councils so that the conservation area can continue its work, protecting the watershed, maintaining trails, dealing with invasive species, and delivering programs that the public enjoy. You'll hear various board members express their own concerns on how can the budget be stretched to meet these new requirements? Will the staff manage? The time, how will that work out to be needed to fulfill the act? And will trails have to be closed if municipalities feel that they can't contribute to the maintenance of one in their area? So we can listen to the clip from the Grand River in June. Thanks, Alex.
At the end of last year, the beginning of this year, with the new regs and everything coming through, we struck a smaller committee to try to get some focus on this huge thing we have coming at us.
GRCA or conservation authorities would be asked to comment on it or provide recommendations, but the government could pick and choose which recommendations it would accept or which ones it would use. And to me, that's kind of defeating the purpose of a non-government agency with the expertise to evaluate these issues, putting their time into making those comments if they're not going to be taken and decisions are not based on science. I don't think it should ever become political decisions that determine how official policies or land use is determined. So
I find it, I guess, distressing that this organization has been dismantled into these three buckets. The one thing that I find is, I mean, just as an example, is fairly short-sighted in a document, and it's really a comment more than anything else. The invasive species issues along the watershed can be potentially quite threatening and damaging to our complete watershed. And I find it short-sighted that it's in a non-mandatory bucket that's just kind of left hanging to the individual municipality. Invasive species in particular need a coordinated effort through all municipalities. So that's really my comment on that.
I have a feeling it's sort of a download to the municipalities somehow, or that things will be dropped off if municipalities don't agree. There seems to be a lot of stuff, and we've got municipalities that can handle it and municipalities that can't. And I just find it, I also feel that there's a lot of busy work going on here, particularly for GRCA, where we're so far ahead on a lot of this, and that's my concern.
I have a question. Do you have an estimate of the labor requirements and costs to meet the province's expectations in terms of providing all this information and meeting with communities to establish these MOUs? I mean, my concern is this going to take our existing staff away from their other current duties in order to focus on completing this?
I think that this is frankly going to be a mess, especially when we've got so many municipalities to deal with. All you're going to need, and many of us are from municipal councils, if you have a couple of councillors who aren't on board or a couple of issues, you could end up hashing out an issue for 6 months. I mean, and you could have a scenario where you've got something that crosses 4 municipalities. 3 of them love it. You went through it in 3 minutes, and the guy right in the middle doesn't want to do it for whatever reason. So I think the amount of effort, time, and staff is going to be unbelievable. There's an additional burden they've put on there where we're supposed to report back to the province every quarter on our progress. And my question to that, well, are you going to help us then or step in? So I think Sam may be able to answer it, but I think this is frankly going to take probably a lot of the board members' help as well, because we're going to be dealing with the municipalities that you represent. So I don't think we know. All I can tell you is my own experience, even with just things as simple as a budget. We have to go out and explain it to councils and walk through it, and there's questions. So when you get down to, my fear is this, we're going to show up at a council and say, we used to provide this recreation service off the levy. Now, if we can't get user pays from the user, the municipality is going to step up. If I'm on that council, the answer is going to be, we're not paying for conservation services. Like, you're going to get that argument, and it's going to be difficult, right? So I think part of what's going to have to happen here is the messaging back to the folks in the province that this isn't us removing these services. It's going to be difficult to get the municipalities to justify using property tax dollars to move into things that were traditionally through the Conservation Authority. So,
thank you, Chair White. I guess one question I have is, will this impact our trailways? So I'm thinking of the Lark Cataract Trailway, the Cambridge to Hamilton Trailway.
So bottom line is some things may go away. If you can't use levy dollars and there's no other funding source and the users aren't prepared to put in a fee and the municipality won't put the dollars up, there's some of the dilemmas we're facing. So we'll have to one step at a time. Guy?
Thank you, Chris. I just want to echo about in my mind, this is just an administrative nightmare trying to do this, and the concept of reducing red tape or streamlining things, this does doesn't work for me with what is being proposed. My other concern is the source water protection and the levy. And I still, when I read this, it just makes no sense how they're even considering any alternative other than for them to continue to fund it. But it would appear that they may be proposing that it becomes downloaded to the Conservation Authority. So I just throw that out as comments.
I think this is a divide and conquer approach to have those services disappear as one municipality and two municipalities and so on start cutting that from their budgets in a tight budget year.
It's a monster. And you know what, staff, I'll just bluntly, what I'm looking at, we may need to give staff some more resources. You may end up with a municipal relations something. We'll have to see how it goes.
It is going to be a nightmare, and I don't see any solution without them retracting some of the things they're trying to do.
You know, anything you need from the board or any way we can support you. This is going to be a long road. At the end of last year, the beginning of this year, with the new regs and everything coming through,
Sorry about that, folks. But yeah, I think some of the words there, just while we're moving to the next one, some of the words there, like a nightmare, a monster, it's really telling. I think that how we're feeling or what we've noticed about these changes really is paralleling how many folks at the GRCA. Yeah, so I think it is a huge concern, and we are excited to go to our next speaker. So Jim, are you able to introduce where we're going next?
Sure. We're going to be hearing from Hassan Bassett, and this is a recorded clip, and Hassan is going to introduce himself. I must say that I had asked a number of questions. I forwarded them to him and did an interview. And in order to keep this short, I've cut out the questions, most of the questions that were asked. And so hopefully you'll be able to follow along. I should also add that Hassan has graciously agreed to come on for the question and answer period. So you will be able to ask him questions directly later on in the program. So we'll go ahead and see this video.
We just had a bit of trouble loading it in, so I'm going to play it from my computer. So Jim, if you could just say, yep, you can hear me, to just make sure this one is going well. Oh.
Just make sure that you tick that box that says video.
My name's Hassan Bassett. I'm the president and CEO of Conservation Halton, which is one of 36 conservation authorities in Ontario. I'm also the chair of the Conservation Authorities Working Group, which was established in December last year, maybe January, early this year. And we were tasked with providing advice to the Minister of Environment, Conservation and Parks and ministry staff on the regulations that were to be produced as a result of the legislative amendments to the Conservation Authorities Act. They have named these historic categories, if you will. And so they've said there are mandatory programs, and those are programs that the province defines as being downloaded by the province to the CAs to implement. And they've taken those pieces, which the province is delegating to the Conservation Authority, and called them mandatory programs. Everything else that a CA has always done at a local level still exists. It is just not in the mandatory bucket. But the programs that are not in the mandatory bucket are not by default to be referred to as non-mandatory programs. They are simply the local priority programs that you work with your local municipalities. And the reason the province is calling their delegated programs mandatory is because the province doesn't fund those programs anymore. They used to, but they don't anymore. The municipalities fund them. And so this is the province kind of making it very clear that any provincial programs that we've delegated to the CAs have to be paid for by the local municipality. One of the changes that was made was that where a ministerial zoning order, an MZO, is issued by the province, a conservation authority cannot deny a permit to the applicant in that case. So and that was ensconced right in the legislation. So it is not something that the working group had the ability to undo. But it is scoped. If we lost the ability to not issue permits across the watershed, there is no reason for a conservation authority to exist anymore. It is the very core of how we keep Ontarians safe from flood hazards in a progressive way moving forward, and not rely on over-engineering ourselves by building dams and channels and all of this gray infrastructure. So currently, that is the only area where we've been told through the legislation not to deny a permit, but we can attach conditions to the approval of a permit. And what the conservation authorities who have been faced in these early days with MZOs have been doing is that they've been studying the application and attaching conditions that would mitigate the impact of that development on the flood hazard.
Does the core mandate include each of the following: camping, ecological restoration, and land acquisition? Those are items that I guess I'm asking because it doesn't sound like those are passive.
So again, there's a purpose statement in the Conservation Authorities Act. It's the very beginning of the act that says the purpose of the CA is to exist for these reasons. And that purpose statement remains to this day, similar to what it has always been. So there is a broad mandate for conservation authorities. And then there's categorization of programs, as I mentioned, mostly for reasons to clarify who pays for it and what the scope of some of them will be. The items that you mentioned on your list actually fall in different buckets. So camping is not considered, may not be considered passive recreation. It's not explicitly called out. What does that mean? So if it is not considered passive recreation, then you can't make a municipality pay you to offer camping. But you can still offer camping and offset the cost of it by charging the campers. And that's something, for example, that we've always done at my conservation authority, where we have never charged the municipality to fund any of our recreation programs, whether they're active or passive. So we have, to put it in perspective, we have 1.5 million people who visit our conservation areas in Halton. And it's the user fees that we charge that pay for all of the parks, all of the services, all of the capital, the upkeep, everything related to it, including all administrative corporate expenditures. Climate change and any mitigation efforts are not explicitly included in the core mandate. They are, again, going to fall in that local priorities section. So when a CA starts to develop its watershed strategy, it would be up to the CA and the local municipality to decide how much of a climate change lens they need to take in that area. And so it's not something that the province is weighing in on one way or another. So my CA may sit down with our local municipalities and they may say, we really do want to work on mitigation with you. And so we think that should be a priority because, various data suggests that it is. And in other areas, it just may be about adaptation and other things. And so the slate is as wide as it always has been. It is really going to be up to the CA and the municipalities to decide what the priorities are and then agree to fund those priorities. The risk is if certain municipalities, given this opportunity, start to look at programs and say, well, we don't want to pay for this one anymore, and this one anymore. And that's a big risk because CA's budgets are on a shared basis. So if there are 8 funding municipalities based on how much the watershed and population and CBA, is in the CA's jurisdiction, they all contribute to the cost of a program. That could be monitoring, providing education service. If 1 or 2 municipalities pull out, you know, what does that do to the budget? And it's not always, you know, at some point the thermostat model doesn't work anymore, where you can keep lowering the level of service and the funds will be matching it. At some point it turns into a light switch where it's either on or it's off, because either you've lost the sustainability from funding or you've lost the reach of the program where it's no longer adding value.
Thanks so much, Jim, and thanks so much, Hassan, for that. I really just, before we go to our next speaker and then we'll go to a bit of a Q&A, just really want to underscore, like, I think to myself and I think of who my city councilor is, and I encourage everyone on this call to think of who their city councilor is. If you don't know who your city councilor is, what a great opportunity to do some Googling. And, find out who your city councilor is and think, are they on the local conservation authority board? Before I started volunteering with 350, I probably wouldn't have known that. But if they are, if they aren't, are they a climate champion? Like, are they standing up for climate change and the climate crisis day in and day out, demanding climate action? Because under these changes, we've heard now a couple of times, oh, it's at the municipality's discretion. Oh, it's at the municipality's discretion. I think about some of the councillors we've encountered doing conservation watch at the Hamilton Conservation Authority. Mentioned one earlier who said, oh, we would have absolutely put forward this development on the wetland. It's just you lost the PR strategy. We've seen many of the councillors on the CA board, when they run for Hamilton City Council, their elections are largely funded by developers. Yet then they go to kind of continue to sit on the Conservation Authority board. And where some conservation authorities are made up of multiple municipalities, the Hamilton Conservation Authority is solely made up of the Hamilton City Council. So that kind of, if there are a few councillors who are maybe very close to developers or don't have the climate change lens you want, it's not watered down as much in places like the Hamilton Conservation Authority. So each conservation authority is different, but that's a concern we've heard a lot of times now is, oh, it's up to municipalities. So to kind of knit us together and kind of look at these things from more of a provincial scope, we have Phil Podden from Environmental Defense. Phil's an environmental lawyer, expertise in land use planning, and he'll be speaking tomorrow at a webinar we hope you all also take some time to attend. A key year ahead in protecting Ontario's environment. So that's tomorrow, 6:30 to 8. Staff or maybe someone else, or we'll make sure if it can't go in the chat, we'll send it out to you where you can RSVP for that. But Phil, can you, and Dawn, I guess as well, can you kind of talk us through what's going on at more of a provincial level?
Sure. I was wondering if I'm able to share the screen at this point, or is this, I'm sorry, my segment? Or are we talking about just a little bit of an intro to what's happening tomorrow night?
Sorry, Phil, are you able to speak a little bit louder? And I think you're asking to share your screen, which I can set up for you.
Okay, sure. And I just wanted to clarify, are we talking about just introducing what's happening tomorrow night, or are we into my segment at this point?
Yeah, you can give us a quick plug for tomorrow night, but let's focus mostly on CAs for today.
Okay, sure.
And you should be able to share your screen.
Great. Let's see, is it going through all right? Hold on.
And then Phil, I don't know if you're able to, maybe it's just me, but if you could speak a little louder, closer to your mic, I think we'd all appreciate that a bit.
Yeah, sure. It's rare that I'm usually speaking too loud rather than too quietly. Hi everyone. So I'm Phil Pothen with Environmental Defense. So there's some overlap between what I was going to cover and what's been covered so far. So I'm just going to try to drill down on one particular sort of theme or subset of concerns around these changes to the Conservation Authorities Act and around these regulations specifically, and this narrow approach to defining the core mandate of conservation authorities. Just want to make sure, first of all, that everyone can see what we are looking at here.
Yeah, looks good.
All right. So the origin of these regulations we're talking about today, and is Bill 229, which was this amendment to the Conservation Authorities Act and some other related pieces of legislation that was passed last fall around this time, right? Introduced last fall around this time and passed early December. So the way that I want to kind of help conceptualize this is that this is just one of the pieces of the sort of groundwork for what we would call a land invasion. And when I say a land invasion, first of all, I apologize for the military analogy, but the attacks on conservation authorities are somewhat analogous to the sort of softening up, bombing, dropping in paratroopers that happens in the lead up to a land invasion of a country. And in this case, the metaphorical land invasion that we're talking about is an actual physical land invasion, which we call an environmental defense, the big sprawl. And the big sprawl is a set of policies that's basically set to kind of abandon the whole concept of smart growth, to price the next 30 years of homes and workplaces out of existing neighborhoods where the people say they want to live based on our polling, and exile new households and businesses into greenfield sprawl, so that 30 more years of Carter-Bennett sprawl happens, and you end up enriching a lot of folks who own and have stockpiled land which is currently not open for development applications. And in the process, it's meant to sacrifice huge swaths, talking hundreds of square kilometers, or more than 150,000 acres, likely in the Greater Golden Horseshoe alone, of the best farmland and natural heritage. That is the main event here. That's what's meant to be accomplished through these broad suite of policies. And the core of that agenda are these actually, not high profile, but these regulatory or even policy changes to the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe that are meant to actually mandate municipalities to extend their settlement area boundaries to absorb a lot of land. But also all of these other supporting pieces to really clear away the obstacles to that sprawl actually happening. So we have, billions of dollars being proposed to be blown on these sprawl superhighways that really don't, they don't run through land that's developed now. They don't really serve a viable, plausible transportation need that exists now. But what they do is they run through land that is owned by sprawl developers that's currently outside the settlement area boundary, but which the government would like to see added to the settlement area boundaries and converted to sprawl. Some of this land is adjacent to the Greenbelt. It's land that probably should be added to the Greenbelt, but it's not in there now. And so the highways are meant to push that. There's a repeal by stealth of the Endangered Species Act, which eliminates the fact of land being habitat. Even then, it can be developed on, it can be converted to sprawl and other forms of development. Sprawl MZOs, we hear a lot of these, and they certainly form, a sort of reciprocal or, a piece with the Conservation Authorities Act changes, but they're really designed by and large now and are being used now to form these beachheads for larger sprawl. So it's not just the land that is within the MZO that is affected, but it creates a pretext and is used to sort of railroad municipalities into absorbing all the land around them. And so we'll hear a lot tomorrow about something similar, which is a hospital proposal for land on the headwaters of the Carruthers Creek that really ought to be added to the Greenbelt. But that's being used as another form of beachhead for sprawl. And then finally, we have MZOs being exempted from basic planning principles. So we've seen that oftentimes the government has tried to approve development and then found, wait a sec, well, you can't do it because of endangered species. You can't do it because of conservation authorities. You can't do it because of the provincial policy statement. They've cut through all of those safety nets. And the conservation authorities are one of those safety nets. So when viewed in context, there's no plausible case to be made that this was meant to strengthen or fix or address any real needs within conservation authorities. This is part of a larger agenda of trying to remove anything that might form an impediment to absorbing all this land, shown in yellow, for example, in southern Ontario, but equivalent pieces of land across the Greater Golden Horseshoe. So this means that Bill 229 was designed to sideline and kneecap conservation authorities. So it's quite clear, some of the big changes, as were mentioned, it was meant to force conservation authorities to issue permits for development where there's an MZO. It was meant to let the minister override even conditions that are put on those permits if the minister chooses. It allows a political route of appeal of conservation authority decisions so that developers don't really need to compromise with conservation authorities. They can just roll the dice and hope the minister, they can talk them into approving whatever development they want. So here are some of the big points, the big concerns, and really what some of the other changes that were made hint at the purpose that was meant to be served by getting rid of or by narrowing the core mandate of conservation authorities. So there was one of the sections of the legislation originally was meant to remove the established implied duty of conservation authorities to prioritize watershed-wide objects of the authority over the interests of individual municipalities. What does that mean? That sounds very technical. It means conservation authority members, however they came to be there, whatever municipality they're supposed to come from, they are supposed to put on a completely different hat when they're on the conservation authority. And if something is going to cause flooding, and if something is going to cause serious natural heritage issues or human hazards, it's not supposed to matter to them where that is, whether it's in their home municipality. It's not supposed to matter to them, where the economic benefits of the project that might be scuttled as a result of these concerns are. They're supposed to put on their conservation authority hat, and if it's going to be dangerous, they're supposed to not approve it. And there was an actual very express intention to change that so that each member of a conservation authority was just a representative of the council that they came from. So this meant that if you were from a large council, and we see this sort of dynamic playing out all the time, that one council will very often very cynically try to push through a development that is going to cause flooding in the backyard of another council. And we see this all the time between Ajax and Pickering, where Pickering keeps trying to approve developments that everyone knows are going to cause flooding in Ajax. And whether those developments get approved should not hang on the balance of seats between Pickering and Ajax on the Conservation Authority board. But the intention of this legislation was to create that circumstance, to create a circumstance where these extraneous considerations could start to really influence the kind of decisions that get made at conservation authorities. So this is not a well-intentioned scheme that just has problems. This is a scheme to take apart conservation authorities and to put blinders on conservation authorities. So one of the interesting aims here was that one of the roles that is played by conservation authorities is to participate in Planning Act proceedings and to oppose development applications that are not within their conservation lands, that are elsewhere in the municipality, to oppose them if they're going to cause some harm related to the mandates of conservation authorities. Now, the minister has narrowed the mandate of conservation authorities so that that authority is limited to a very, very narrow subset of circumstances. You know, these are, and we'll see what those are, but they're basically, you know, direct flooding, you know, direct, it's defined in a very geographically narrow way. And we'll see that with the regulations, they leave large aspects of this work, you know, work about, you know, what is the aggregate impact of paving land in a municipality? What's that impact going to be on flood risk? You know, a lot of this pertains to land that itself is not hazard land. So that's outside the scope of municipalities, of the conservation authorities now. All right. So the regulation that was just introduced is regulation 686/21. It's the mandatory programs and services regulation. And as discussed, there are these sort of general baskets that programs must fall into in order to be mandatory. That is to say, to be funded out of provincial coffers. And so here, for example, while there's a general reference to mandatory programs and services related to the risk of natural hazards, and you could make a case, you know, I think a very solid case, that that's quite a broad authority. These regulations narrow them very much to impacts on wetlands, rivers, streams, shorelines, and soil and bedrock. And they blinker the conservation authority, so they don't get to do this work reviewing other portions of development or other aspects of development in the municipality without getting funding from the municipality to do it. You've heard, you know, they don't get funding for recreation and at all, you know, because passive recreation is recreation that doesn't cost money. So it's only these core mandatory programs that get any funding, and for everything else, they're sort of left begging. And so what is this? What is the implication of this? We've heard, you know, from the previous speaker, what the direct effect is on the kinds of services that can be provided. And I agree with everything that was said. To some extent, you know, it constrains the type of services that can be provided. You know, yes, there are ways to fund it, but, you know, there's obviously then there are user fees involved. I'm not going to get into that too much because that's been covered. My concern and environmental defense's concern that I think I'd like to cast some light on, and I think it's something that we can talk about in a way that someone from a conservation authority can't, because of the implications of it. We're very concerned that narrowing the core mandate and requiring conservation authorities to go asking municipalities for money to do large portions of the work that they want to do, that people want them to do, it means that in some ways they are beholden. I mean, they've always been beholden, but they are more beholden than ever to those municipalities whose interests are not aligned with the watershed interests sometimes that the conservation authority is meant to protect. So oh, I don't know if that was my own voice just mirrored back to me there.
You're okay now, Phil.
Yeah, so hold on. Well, let's give an example. So if there is a program like a more active form of recreation, conservation programming, that there isn't funding for Conservation Authority of Wildlife, a lot of these species risk removal programs. These are programs that a conservation authority is naturally going to want to do, but they're going to be dependent, and to some extent they already are, but even more so going forward with more issues. They're dependent on municipalities to fund these. And this means that when they're doing something within their core mandate, like, you know, assessing the degree of hazard risk, you know, or that hazard associated with a development application that a municipal council supports, there is no way around it. In the back of the conservation authority's head, there is going to be, well, don't we need to be perceived as reasonable by this council? What's going to happen next time we go back and ask them for funding for our other programs if we've said no to this request from the council? And it's really not a healthy relationship. In most cases, we wouldn't allow that kind of relationship between a body that has to be able to say no remorselessly to to applicants and to other interests. It's not usually appropriate to have a situation where that same body has to go asking that interest for money. And so that's why we say, it's not just about the services that fall outside the core mandate. Narrowing the core mandate is a way to undermine, very intentionally, to undermine the independence. And this is not about conservation authorities being corrupt. No human being is able to remain independent in these circumstances. That's why these relationships are usually prohibited, so that even so this situation of regulatory capture doesn't happen. So what we would like to see is a substantial broadening of the core mandate of conservation authorities, a substantial increase in direct funding from the province to provide the full range of services, and a very clear, a much clearer authority for conservation authorities to speak out, whenever they feel that there's something happening in the watershed, which is a problem from the point of view of the overall, watershed protection objectives of the conservation authority.
Yeah, thank you.
We need to cut those puppet strings as much as possible.
Thank you for that, Phil, and thank you for kind of your analysis and some of the concerns from environmental defense. If folks want to hear more from you or environmental defense, I just want to plug again that you have a webinar tomorrow that talks about a lot of these changes going on at the provincial level. I'm just going to take back over screen sharing if that's all right.
Sure.
Thank you. So this is the webinar tomorrow. And yeah, just to kind of close this out, because we are running close to time, I just want to say that, in summary, Hamilton 350, we've had a lot of perspectives shared tonight. You've heard from conservation authority watchers, some of the folks who've been volunteering with our program. You heard from the kind of candid reactions from some conservation authority board members with the Grand River Authority to when these changes were kind of first coming to their doorstep. Heard from Hassan Bassett, who has kind of helped steer the province in helping make these regulations, as well as sits on the Halton Conservation Authority Board as chair. We've heard from Phil Podden, and soon we're really hoping to hear from you. But to kind of summarize some of the trends that we heard tonight, and some of kind of 350's analysis of this situation for you folks, we've noticed that, Fort's changes have clearly created some chaos and shock. We heard it, I believe, called, like a monster was one of the words. It's going to be a disaster was some of the language we heard. So as navigating these new requirements for a government that keeps talking about cutting red tape, it clearly seems to be putting some bureaucratic barriers in front of conservation authorities. We've seen that some of these changes can definitely look like a downloading of the cost of important programs to be funded by municipalities or rely on self-generated revenue. And that's going to be a change that different CAs adapt to differently. So we heard that Halton already has a lot of their recreation programs that are self-funded, but not all CAs do. So what will the impact look like across Ontario? And because it may be a smaller impact, it may not get the provincial-wide news, despite the changes are all coming from the same place. This focus on self-generated revenue has a lot of pros and cons, and this is something that conservation authorities, I'm sure, talk about a lot in terms of balancing land use with kind of funding the program. But one of our concerns is that especially increases in kind of fees can lead to inaccessible programming, or we heard with the kind of thermostat to light switch model lead to their cancellation if funds not enough people can afford to go or not enough people can attend. And some of the big questions that still remain are how these changes will impact climate-related programs. Kind of around the Conservation Matters Hamilton 350 table, we've been talking a lot about, conservation authorities do such incredible work, Now that we're in a climate crisis where we know we need to be scaling up a lot of this policy and doing more, doesn't it make sense to start with bodies that are already doing this work or already have expertise? And rather than scaling up some of this climate work and formalizing some of this climate work, which is something we've talked about a lot as being ideal, we're seeing that's becoming harder or unclear how this work will continue, or maybe there's going to be more barriers put in front. We'll have to see as kind of some of these changes come into effect. And this one size fits all solution, in quotes, is all to a problem that, or is all being justified to solve a problem that we're not really sure at the 350 table ever existed. We've had some concerns with our local CA. So for example, like with the offsetting policy paper and with respect to the wetland, we had over 200 people submit comments. We're going to hear back about how our comments were received and what staff's report looks like in the next month or two, and we'll keep you updated. So it's not to say that, we're all the same, but we're not really sure what the governance problems that the Ford government believes to existed are and how they're being solved by these new regulations. It is clear, as Phil maybe suggested, that some other problems existed between the Ford government and CAs, and those had to do with development. And we do see how these changes may have an impact there. So we do want to hear from you. So I don't want everyone to jump off right away, because we have some breakout rooms and we have time for just a quick few questions from the chat. But before we do, I just wanted to throw it off to Hassan Bassett, because you've been with us the whole time. Thank you so much for doing your interview, but you're with us live. And just if you wanted to cover anything that you think has been missed or add anything, we don't want to miss this opportunity of having you here.
Thanks, Alex. I'm hearing myself again. If you can mute. Thanks. Okay, that's good. So again, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. And I wanted to point out a few things, only because I think if there's an engaged group of citizens, whether you're organized in groups or whether you're individuals, there's a lot that you can do to further conservation in this province. But in order for you to do that effectively, I think you have to have the right information. And there are some things, and I can understand this has been a bit of a journey. It started back in January. There were a lot of changes made to the actual legislation at the last minute that were actually good. And one of those changes was, as I mentioned in the chat, the removal of the clause in the CA Act that compelled municipally appointed board members to act in the interest of their appointing municipalities. That does not exist in the CA Act anymore. It was removed. So that is not accurate. The other thing I wanted to mention is there's a purpose statement in the Conservation Authorities Act. I'll read it. The purpose of this act is to provide for the organization and delivery of programs and services that further the conservation, restoration, development, and management of natural resources in watersheds in Ontario. This is a very broad purpose statement that remains in the Act. There is no such thing as a core mandate of conservation authorities. It is not referenced. Yes, the province has taken everything we do and they've put it into 3 different buckets, but there was nothing in the CA Act in the past that actually gave any of the programs that are not in category 1 any sort of mandatory status. There was nothing that ever said that CAs must be paid for doing environmental monitoring, that they must be paid for providing recreation programs, that they must be paid for doing invasive species management, or any of that stuff. It was never there. We have always gone to our local municipalities and made the case that these are local priorities, that they don't need to be reflected in provincial legislation, because CAs were formed to do 2 things, and it still remains true. One was to carry out provincial priority programs, and the other was to actually work with the local communities, the local councils, to find out what are the local conservation issues and address those. That's why CAs are always formed, because local municipalities initiated their formation. And so we still have all of those abilities. The province, through the legislative changes or through the regulations, have not banned us or stopped us or listed anything that we can no longer do. And that's a myth out there that needs to be corrected as well. We still retain the broad mandate, and we still have the ability to carry everything out. We go to the municipalities to ask for funding for those. We have always done that. There is, and so, I think rather than focus on the province, it is very clear that the focus of local activism needs to be at the local level, because we will be going to municipalities to seek continued support for our programs. There are going to be a few new costs. I think Phil pointed them out, or maybe one of the earlier speakers. There's some things that CAs have to do now. They're going to cost some money, but generally it's the same programs being paid for by the same municipalities through the same sources of funding, the municipal tax levy. What the province has done is it's shone a light on it, and it has kind of said, municipalities, you've always been paying for this stuff, but you don't have to. That's all that's happened here. Now, we need to ensure that we continue to demonstrate the value of those programs, and in fact, as Alex was saying, put a climate change lens on it, and actually urge a redoubling of the commitment for those programs, and really work at the local level to achieve those things. So those are just some of the things I wanted to say. Every time I hear core mandate, it kind of makes me nervous. Every time I hear mandatory programs and the opposite being non-mandatory, it makes me nervous. And then the last thing I want to say is there is a mandatory program, which was a very hard fought win for us, that relates to core watershed resource management strategies. That is a very broad catch-all mandatory program, which was our attempt to underscore the watershed basis of CAs. So what goes in a watershed strategy mandatory program? It's everything that a CA and their local municipality can agree is critical to managing flood hazards and broader conservation efforts, within their local municipalities. So if I think in Halton that environmental monitoring, invasive species management, tree planting, restoration, stewardship are critical to managing the watershed, then I will put those in the mandatory bucket. And, so there are a lot of tools available. The province has not dictated, they have not been overly prescriptive in the regulations. And that is very much appreciated, because that means that a lot of this is down to the local level. Now, could it have been better? Some of the things that Phil mentioned at the end, we'd like this, we'd love those too. But we couldn't, we weren't going into this thinking we would get any of those things. And so, we're still around, and we appreciate the support. And I think, there's a provincial election coming, but there's also a municipal election coming, and these matters need to be really debated at the local level, just as important as at the provincial level.
Thank you for that so much. And you actually answered, I think, one of the questions we had about the significance of adding that watershed planning to the mandatory program right at the end. So I do see that we just have, I believe, 2 other questions that could be addressed to some folks. And then we're going to jump into some breakout rooms after that. So I'm going to go to Grit and then Phil, and then we'll jump into some breakout rooms if that's okay. So yeah, Grit, if you just want to unmute. And thanks so much to everyone for their participation so far.
Hello? Grit?
Yep, I'm here.
You have a hand up.
Yeah, do you have your hand up to ask a question?
Yes, well, okay, but if we're going into breakout rooms, then maybe not, but I don't know.
No, I apologize, Grit. That was me speaking to you on the chat. And I was saying I would leave it to Alex to decide what they felt. And he said, you're welcome to go ahead at this time.
Yeah,
okay.
We'd love to hear your question. Yeah.
So I
All right.
apologize.
Well, I don't even think it's a question. I have been attending every single council meeting, planning meeting, county meetings for the past 5-6 years plus. And I am disgusted by the dialogue that is coming out of our council members' mouths now, because they're sitting there saying, well, we don't need the conservation authorities. they're charging us too much. And I don't know where they're getting this rhetoric from, but I think we need to take a much stronger stance than what I'm hearing here at this table, because I'm the one that's attending all of these council meetings and I'm hearing it and it bothers me. So what can you do to help me get further on that?
Great, that's, I think, a great question. I'm glad you put the attention to what you're hearing in your local municipality. I'd encourage you really to start watching with the program. It sounds like you're already doing all this work. If you could connect to us across the province, we can share those common themes, build resistance. And that's actually, where do we go from here is the topic of the breakout room. So I'm hoping some of the folks there will also be able to help you out. But I'm grateful that you shared that perspective about some of the difficulties. Phil,
Okay.
do you want to finish us off with just a last quick question, and then we're going to jump into some breakout rooms.
Yeah, sorry, no, I just wanted to clarify a point regarding the former section 14.1. Mr. Bassett Hassan was right in saying it's not included. And the reason I raised 14.1 is I think was relevant to what we think was a lot of the intent of the legislation, because it was included, but then removed after public outcry. And that was the provision which would have removed the implied duty of conservation authority members to prioritize watershed objects over those of their own municipalities. So it is a very strange thing to have tried to include in this legislation if you intended to maintain the independence of conservation authorities. And so, to us, that kind of, informs our interpretation of what these provisions are meant to do. Now, and I understand and I respect the position that Mr. Bassett is in, because, we're in that same situation with respect to the big sprawl and the land use planning provisions, where, of course, I respect and I agree. Listen, I'm all for conservation authorities taking the broadest and most favorable interpretation of these rules and asserting, the broadest interpretation of what they're allowed to do. But it's a fine line to walk between doing that and, on the other hand, saying, well, I see what the government is trying to do here, and I think we need to hold the government accountable for what they're trying to do, even as, on the other hand, we say, you know what, you might have wanted to do this, but as with many other things, they haven't effectively done that, and we shouldn't let them. We should certainly use whatever mandate can be argued is in these rules to the greatest possible effect.
Yeah, thanks for that, Phil. And we can keep the conversation going and it can focus on strategy. So I'm going to open up the breakout rooms. You're going to get a little prompt. Just hit join on your screen. We're going to come back at 8:35, so in 12-ish minutes. And then we'll kind of enter into an open discussion, or if you have to head out sometime during the breakout room or after, totally fine. But we'd love to hear from you in just this segment. So here we go. And you just got to hit the join button when it pops up on your screen.
I'm supposed to be in facilitating a breakout room?
Yeah, did you not get added to one?
I did, but Dawn was in there.
Oh, Phil, Rosemary, Sue's in that one, Zoe's in that one. So I didn't do one because we had some folks jump off. Jim's in that one, Dawn's in that one, David's all alone in that one.
I can go with David.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to add you to one now that they've started.
I laughed because Dawn was like, I thought you were doing one. I was like, I don't know.
Oh, I just have to find you. That's all. You're Katie King, not Catherine King.
Yeah, it's because I sent the link to someone else,
Yeah.
and they're using my Zoom link, so it came up as my name when I spelled it wrong.
Perfect. Yeah, you and David can chat. You'll be by yourselves, but
Okay.
hi, welcoming committee.
Hey, it's Ria. Can I get into a different breakout session? I'm just
Yeah.
assigned to room 6, so anything else.
Yeah, was that one just not? Oh, you're just looking to get new faces.
Yeah.
I'm gonna look for one whose names I don't know. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna throw you in room 3 because I think either you or me know everyone in all the other rooms at this point.
Thanks.
Didn't like that one?
No, Kim is actually assisting me. She's part of the welcoming committee now. So I think she's nailed it down. I took a few notes and left.
Oh, okay. I can put you in room 1.
Sure.
Welcome back, everyone. There we go. I think everyone should be back with us now. So I just want to say thank you. I hope your conversations went well. I'm sorry I didn't get to bump into them, so I'm excited to get caught up. We took notes as the 350 team, and we're going to use some of the conversations we had with all of you to inform where we go next and how we kind of approach. We're going to keep the chat going here, but we do want to give folks who've already stayed with us for 90 minutes and have to kind of eat their dinner, get going, the chance to jump out. Thank you for joining us all. We will be sending out an email to all of you on the link you registered with to kind of keep that conversation going. We'll send you a recording. We'll send you some resources. If you can join the Yours Protect webinar, Environmental Defense, and others are putting on tomorrow, that would be a great immediate next step. And locally, something we'll keep you in the loop with is what's happening with offsetting in the Hamilton Conservation Authority. But until then, if folks have stuff they want to share about what was going on in their breakout room, I'm sure the whole group would love to hear it. And yeah, thanks everyone. Yeah, Jim, why don't you get us started?
Sure. We had quite a small group, so we had a fulsome discussion. And the concerns that were raised were, first of all, the conservation authorities losing their ability to say no under MZO conditions. There were also general concerns about the changes and how things might reduce the ability of conservation authorities to get all their work done. There were concerns about the cutback of the proportion of citizens that are on these conservation authority boards of directors, because there seems to be quite a tendency for politicization by members of councils. So those were the main concerns. The main ways to get where we would like to go to improve on those things were basically focused on two things. The municipal elections and the provincial elections, getting these people that are getting in the way of conservation authorities out of their positions and replacing them with people that actually care about conservation, particularly those who sit on conservation authority boards. And the other point that was made was, can we publicize the positions that politicians in our municipal system are, the positions that they're taking on conservation? Can we spread the word so that when it comes time to elect new councillors, people know which ones don't take conservation very seriously and might do something about that? So that's what we talked about.
Yeah, Jim, and are you able to, why don't we do that? Can you throw it to someone else when you're done? So Carol Ann's hand is up, but Carol Ann, when you're done speaking, why don't you throw it to someone else who's looking like they're trying to jump in as well?
Okay, we had a very nice discussion about the fact, well, first of all, the fact that people don't know what conservation authorities do. They think that they're perhaps just local parks. They don't realize the extent of what they're responsible for. A couple of people voiced concern about the citizen committees, whether how many citizens are on those boards, whether they have an impact or input. We decided it's time to become politically involved, and in general, just to educate the local population through maybe flyers or much more media on understanding, so the public can understand the issues that the conservation authorities are going through. Anybody else? Sue.
I'll do it. Yeah, we heard about the Eramosa cast and how a small concerned group of citizens managed to save that, and so that it wasn't all put into development. So that's amazing. So I think that says, you know, what we do can make a difference, and I think we've seen that tonight as well. And then the part of the land of Eramosa cast became built up, and then the developer said, oh, look at this beautiful parkland you've got next to you, wouldn't you like to buy a house here? So they turned what they couldn't build on into something that they use for advertising. And we had Phil on our group as well, and he says that we've made mistakes in the past and we have to think about the future now. So things like our stop sprawl and so on, we have to be more efficient on where we build and how we build, and to use up the city land and not to get into the countryside. And lots of things that people love to do, walking the trails and looking after turtles. It's great to know that so many people are already doing this. And I think having a night like tonight shows that you're not alone anymore. So if you thought you were doing something and nobody else cared, I hope you realize that we do care, and we're here, and we'd love to have more of you volunteer if you're able to.
Sue, you've been muted, but Brody, I see
Don,
your hand up. You are done, Sue.
Don, do you want to go?
No, Brody's fine.
So as I understood, the question was like, what's the top of mind concern at the moment and with conservation authorities, and how do we kind of get to a better place. I feel like one of the big concerns to me is like culturally, it feels as if there's like a real sense of the environment or some of the natural systems being expendable or taking a lower priority place in terms of some of the bureaucratic structures we have. And a way that I feel that it's important we get there would be looking at ways to kind of ingrain it more into our culture, so that in terms of like our games, for instance, like, you know, people watching sports, things like that, the things that bind us culturally together as communities, that they have more focus or respect for the natural world, so that it's kind of more ingrained in the culture and we're less reliant on a single organization to be holding up some of these things. You know, like I would want my municipal councilors to be thinking about some of these watershed things in their decisions, regardless of what the conservation authority is doing or not. You know, I want them to be looking at these sorts of systemic issues as well, and not just kind of shrugging their shoulders like, oh, there's another government agency to deal with that. Like that's not a part of my mandate, you know, just with sort of myopic focus. And I will hit it off to Grit.
Thank you. Brody? Yeah, you want your council members to do all those right things, but guess what? They're not going to. I have been following local councils for over 6 years closely, and my own township for over 12. So, and when I say following, I mean attending all the council meetings. And I don't think there's many people that can say they actually do that, but I do. And I report on them, and I post them, and I share them. And occasionally I give my opinion. I try to remain sort of neutral. But there comes a time when I can no longer remain neutral. And right now, I remain no longer neutral. I have to state that we need to protect and preserve our farmlands and our natural heritage systems that exist within this province. And I don't know what it will take, but I think it takes all of us as a community across the entire province. We need to find a way to come together to make that the most important thing that we do going forward, because I am so tired of watching our local councils disassemble our rural townships. And we are faced with a real threat in Alnwick-Haldeman Township, which is a 100% rural township. And Land Lab Inc. from Quebec wants to come in and plop in a subdivision, a urban subdivision in a rural community on active farmland, not even remotely resembling anything that could be acceptable within any of the planning principles. And so why is that happening? I see that as, I don't know. I think it's the cancer that's growing. And if we don't stop it, it's going to continue to grow. So we need to stop this wherever it's happening, because there's too many areas in our province that are just being steamrolled over.
Thanks very much for that, Grit. We were trying to get to the people that took notes. So I wonder if we could go to, let's say, Zoe, people that represented the 350 committee. Did you get some notes from your group, Zoe?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. It was a group of us that I think there was consensus in terms of some of the things that were important. The discussion really centered around biodiversity and habitat and the need to protect those resources. There was a conversation around climate change, and I think a lot of people in this webinar understand the connection of those points or the intersections, but there were also comments around, writing letters and making phone calls. Sometimes it doesn't seem to be enough anymore, and they're trying to find other ways to protect what they love and protect these important environmental and natural resources, these features that still exist. So that was sort of the general theme in the conversation and in our breakout room. So Don has his hand up. We'll go over to him, please.
Thanks. I was leading one of the breakout groups. It was a small group as well, but we had the good fortune of having both Grit and Hassan in that group. And that brought out a couple of interesting points. A recognition that the pressure to actually make the changes that have been made by the province may well have come from the rural areas like where Grit is, and the kinds of things she's hearing at her council. And where they're basically saying, we don't want to pay for conservation authorities. They're just an extra expense. And we don't want them standing in our way of what we want to do. So that's an indication, I think, of a threat that we haven't really talked about, which is that what happens in one conservation authority, maybe one like Halton or Hamilton, which are mainly urban in terms of the population, may be dramatically different than what happens in some of the rural conservation authorities, the ones which are dominated by different interests or different classification, different arguments. Hassan also raised, and I think it's really valuable, that in the past, the conservation authorities were actually much more active in focusing on the natural features and the protection of the natural features and the significance of the watersheds and the significance of the natural features that are associated with those. And he remembered that they used to produce annual reports on the state of the watershed. I remember reading those 30 or 40 years ago and being, wow, this is really interesting stuff. They don't do that anymore. In Halton, where he is the CEO, he indicated that unlike some conservation authorities, they actually reject some of the permits. And that's a particularly frightening comment from the perspective of those who live in conservation authorities where they don't reject permits. And the fight that we went through here back in May and June with respect to the wetland in Ancaster, we understood that the decision to reject that permit was a precedent-setting decision. They just don't normally reject permits. So that's another feature that adds to the information that we've been able to accumulate through this process and will continue to inform us. And Sheila did get an opportunity to make a comment about that she's a gardener and clean water is really critical for her, and not only for her gardening, but for her life generally. And a concern that grassroots groups that are doing good work aren't getting funded, that it's just too hard for the funding to come through. And that would be a big improvement that could be moved forward. So that's all from me.
Okay, I believe we still have David. And now I've lost whoever else that was. So perhaps David, if you want to go ahead with your notes, and I'll figure out who I was meaning to say next then. Unless we've lost David. Katie, you're still with us here?
No,
Yeah, there was a bit of a mix-up. So David and Katie were in a room together, but I'd still love to hear either of their updates.
I'm not going to speak for Katie. She's more than capable of speaking for herself, and she's probably about to do so. I just want to leave you with this comment, which is that are we getting a back talk from somewhere else? I don't know. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Yeah. With the greatest respect to Mr. Bassett, I think the solution to this problem is political. And to me, the solution to this problem is to get the hell rid of the Ford government. I'll turn it over to Katie.
Hi, sorry for my errors in the chat. Sometimes I just like type because I'm like thinking and I'm excited and then I really misspell everything. Okay, yeah, we were talking about getting Ford out and we weren't certain, but we thought that the election was in 6 months, like the spring, but I don't know. And then I was talking about in terms of my relationship with land, not necessarily, this doesn't have to, I guess this does have to do with my relationship living in Hamilton. My latest concern has been about now I know because I went on a water walk on the bayfront. And my concern is when I think about every time it rains heavily is about the sewage being let out. And I knew that Hamilton did that weird sketchy stuff, but I just it wasn't in the top of my consciousness. And now I'm just thinking about it all the time. So that's where I'm at. And then I also had a question about maybe for Phil about, if he's still here. Oh, hi. Oh, you're in the main screen. That's why. That I was wondering if the 413 is proposed to run through settlement areas that haven't been expanded yet.
Yeah, so the 413 runs sort of along a line. I can actually share a map of it. I think it runs along a line that between land that is already within the settlement area and land that is proposed to be added to the settlement area. I'm going to open this up and hopefully I'll be able to share an image for you. No, so it's actually, yeah, so it's actually on the boundary between land that is proposed to be added to the settlement area, but is not currently in the settlement area, and land that is not in the settlement area at all, and is actually part of the green belt. So it's a very strange place, needless to say, to put a highway. I don't know if you folks are able to see.
Yeah, you can see.
My cursor is. You look at Peel, under the letters Peel, P-E-E-L. There's area in green, and there's an area in yellow, and you see there's like a banana yellow strip. That is the 413 route. So you see it's away from any land that is actually legally developable now. And it is meant to, create a pretext for that land that's currently yellow to be made developable. And what's especially troubling is it hugs land that is not even on the table for development at all. And yeah, so it's very clearly meant to drive sprawl into places where no one lives now and no one is supposed to ever live. And billions of dollars of public money are being blown to make those lands more valuable for the owners.
So it can't, it's not being built, it's proposed, but it can't, right?
So it's proposed. It was sort of on a pretty straight path to getting approved and built, but it is now being subjected, thanks to a lot of hard work from people who asked for this, to a federal environmental assessment. Now, federal environmental assessment is not necessarily going to kill it. We don't know what the outcome is going to be, but if it's thorough, based on the research that has been done, we think it ought to be rejected. And I think it'll take a lot of continual pressure on your MPs to kind of ensure that things are not allowed to get out of hand there.
Okay, thank you.
So can you unshare your screen, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, so I believe everyone that was taking notes in the chats have shared what came from those chats. I do see Brody's hand up, I believe. I just saw that. And there are certainly a couple other questions that came through the chat during the webinar, if we are still doing it open to discussion, because I believe that was the next step. Yes? Okay, so Brody, if your hand is up, you're welcome to go ahead. And then I've got a list of a couple other people following you.
Thanks. I'll try to be quick. I really appreciate the effort that y'all have put in making this happen, and thank you to our speakers. I had a question for Hassan, which was, I'm kind of curious. I think if I understood you before, you're saying an important thing for us to focus on is locally, municipally, rather than, and besides provincially as well. I'm curious in terms of like sort of even more specific than that, are there opportunities or things that are exciting for you that you feel really like positive or good about in terms of like ways that people can engage or to kind of further broadly this sort of a cultural shift so that more of these natural heritage is being protected, or that our ecological resiliency is being just really honored and respected? Are there things that are apparent to you? I'm kind of just, I was curious.
Yeah, thank you. I'm assuming I can directly answer your question. So, okay, I see Jim nodding. That's a great question, actually. So, and again, I'll go back to the CA model, which is there's a reason they were formed based on watersheds, because each watershed is different. The challenges are different. The growth pressures are different. The amount of land that is in really good shape, to put it simply, or is degraded is different. And what needs to be done to move the needle is different. And so all of the things you mentioned are relevant. And I think, rather than sort of try and put everything under a unfortunately highly politicized term of climate change, it shouldn't be. It's an absolute fact. It is actually very smart to go to local councils and delegate on specific issues and talk about, do we have enough green space set aside? Are our creeks degraded? Is the water quality really poor? Do we even know what the state of the environment is? Should we be investing more in data gathering? No one wants to ever pay for environmental monitoring because they just don't think it's cool. But without it, you have no cohesive picture of what you have, how it is being impacted, let alone how you're going to improve it. And one of the biggest frustrations I have as a conservation authority person who's been in this field for a lot of years and a biologist prior to that, is that there's quite often a disconnect between where you see funding being announced and the needs that are actually in need of those funds and that support and those resources. So I think it's about what is a local narrative that may get traction. That's important as well. Politically, I always like to think that sort of picking a lane that is non-politicized and actually forces people to think about science and data and good decision making is good, because you'll have people's attention. If you're the 56th delegation, on the third night opposed to a specific development, it's falling on deaf ears. It may collectively weigh and tip the balance, and those issues are important. But it's important to find some space and some breathing room and actually go in and discuss issues that are of local importance, whether it's biodiversity, whether it's loss of forest health, whether it's planning related issues, whether it's wetlands. There's just so much, and your local CAs will have that information. If it'll either be available on their website, or they will have watershed strategies or plans or restoration plans listed on their websites. And it's a great starting point for local citizens to actually browse the local CA website and then find something that you feel you'd like more information on. And they'll be more than happy to talk to you and help frame issues. So that's my advice. It's to actually pick a lane that is not noisy and overly politicized, but and then try and really, start a discussion around that with your local politicians. And I'll put a plug in for CAs. As I said earlier, the emphasis shouldn't just be on the provincial government. This is my third Conservation Authorities Act review. And the last two were not by a Conservative government, just to mention, they were by the previous Liberal government, and we got absolutely nothing as a conservation authority movement out of those reviews. So it's important to really focus on local issues, and it's important to ask for funding. If we don't have the resources to do our job, we're going to just continue to shrink and focus on less and less and less. And that progressive lens that Ontario had 60, 70 years ago, where they said, if we're going to fix or tackle flooding issues, if we're going to tackle soil quality issues, if we're going to tackle forest cover issues, we're going to have to do it with a multi-barrier approach that has to be at a broad watershed level. So how is it that we were so progressive as a province 70 years ago that we could figure this approach out? And today, despite more science, more knowledge, more expertise, and frankly, more wealth and money, we seem to be retreating to a very narrow, ignore the science, ignore the data point of view. It's a little disappointing. I don't mean to end on a negative, but.
Oh, that's okay. We appreciate your comments. It's good for everyone to be aware of everything that's going on, whether it's positive or negative. That's how perhaps we make change. I see a couple of hands up, so I'm just going to ask, it's specific to what we're talking about right now, because I do have some questions hanging out in the background as well. So Phil, are you wanting to comment in response to what we're talking about right now? And Grit?
Yeah. Yes. So I kind of wanted to echo a bit of what Mr. Bassett said. I heard some stuff, along the lines of, oh, we just need to get rid of the Ford government, etc. And, like environmental defense is a nonpartisan organization. Whatever the party is, we want them to actually make the changes that we're asking for to give conservation authorities as much independence as possible so that they can say no to things without fear, so they can be authoritative, so they can do their work and never have to worry about whether it's popular with local councillors or with developers. We want them to be an independent agency that makes decisions driven by science and driven by their mandate, and that is that. When looking at the next election is going to be important, but the importance will be based on the specific commitments that the parties give. So just the fact that it's whether it's the current government or another parliament, you want to look at their specific platform commitments and look for their commitments to do the things that we are asking. Take it like a checklist and see, is this party, is that party, are they going to do what environmental defense is asking for, what other environmental NGOs are asking for with respect to the Conservation Authorities Act.
Thanks very much, Phil. Great, you said that your comment is to this as well, or question? Are you still with us, Grant?
Just a minute, I unmuted.
I apologize.
That's okay. I thought I had me unmuted, so I did. But anyways, I listened very closely to Hassan, and I also listened to Phil. But the reality is that we have councils at local levels that are not responding to the greater populace. How do we get over that? Because we can continue to fight the provincial government, which we're going to lose because Ford's agenda is not for conservation. So that is not even a discussion here. So how do we get past that, where we can get it to our local governments that they need to think about this? Because I've heard the narrative. I've heard the narrative directly, and it's coming from above. And they're saying, oh, well, we don't need the conservation authorities. And oh my God, they're costing us so much money. And oh, this and oh, that. I'm not happy. I don't know how to fight it. I'm a little person out here in Alnwick-Haldeman. How do I fight that? I've been trying. I post everything I can. I attend all the council meetings. I'm one person. How do you get the people behind it? Please help me.
Okay, Phil or Hassan, would you like to speak to that? Because I'm quite certain Dawn would if you don't, but I won't put words in anyone's mouth.
I mean, so just again, it's about actually, first of all, really holding, I think someone mentioned, and I can't remember if it was in the breakout room or in the main one. First of all, one of the main things is actually make it public the way that councillors have voted on issues at the Conservation Authority and the way they have voted on decisions to fund the conservation authorities. Like, gather that information together. Keep, you should be taking names and holding grudges, and making and getting other people on board with your grudges, so that it is politically a very scary thing to do, to say no to funding conservation authorities. That is politically a very scary thing to do, to say yes to development on wetlands, to say yes when staff are saying no. And so that means, yeah, it means that's politics, but that's municipal politics. And really, so I would encourage at every municipal level, keep a tally of how councillors voted. It's done for Toronto. There's a guy who does it in Toronto, and draw a big X on the heads of whatever councillor is not behaving the way you want them to, and actually conservatively try to get rid of them, so that all the other councillors are scared going forward. Make yourself a real political force to be reckoned with. That's what it comes down to. That's politics.
May I speak to that? Thank you, Stephanie. Okay, so I have been following our local politics across 3 municipalities in Northumberland County for over 6 years. And in my own municipality for well over 10 years. And we've lived here for 18 years. I will tell you that our councils do not listen to the people, no matter what. Now, having said that, we have had some inroads because we filed formal complaints through ombudsman, integrity commissioner, whatever. But it's so hard to get anywhere. So I'm not sure how far we're going to get with this whole battle about our conservation authorities, who I wholeheartedly support all the way because we need them. But right now, the climate of our local governments and our provincial governments is all about development and push, 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 and that's all they're doing. So how do we stop that? I'm trying. I don't know how to stop it. I'm doing my best, but I don't know how.
Phil, would you like to speak to that, or anyone else? Again, not trying to put the spotlight on you there, but
yeah, I mean, like, listen, I would ask, first of all, to actually consider what the political dynamic is in the municipalities that you're talking about. I mean, we say, municipal governments are not listening to people, but, listening to the people is not about a sort of an earnest, good-natured desire to do what people want. It is about being scared of not getting reelected. And so it's not about talking to them and making your concerns known, but actually getting enough people behind you who are willing to actually vote based on whether politicians do what you want them to do. So that is a lot of work, right? Because that's actually organizing. So in some ways, writing a letter to politicians, showing up and deputing even is not necessarily going to cut it if there isn't the political base for you to tap into to make it an electorally relevant issue. You want to find, like, it's not necessarily, that you're going to actually look evenly at every counselor. Look at a counselor who's vulnerable. Look at a counselor who's fallen into a scandal. They're weak, and you go after them. And now you pile this other issue onto them, and they're more likely to do what you want because they can't handle it. So you pick, 1, 2, or 3, find out how many counselors you need to swing in order to start winning on these points, and bully them, pick on them, like find every opportunity, like grind them down to a point, like get on board with other forms of complaints about them so that they're politically weak, and then they are vulnerable to your ask. Like, this is politics. This is like bare knuckle, get in there, scare them. That's what you got to do. Not just friendly, friendly request, because nothing in politics works on good faith. It works on fear.
I think that's a valid point for sure. I'm not sure if you still have your hand up, Grit, but I do see that, oh no, my thing's in the way here. Anne has her hand up, so I'm gonna put it to Anne. And then Grit, if you do still have your hand up. But I have another couple questions from somebody that I will get to eventually, but this is a good topic. So go ahead, Anne, and then Grit, if you still have your hand up.
To get low and depressed. But as Phil has just pointed out, I think pressure has results. And all you have to do is to look at what happened in Hamilton with the Ancaster wetlands. You now look at what's happened with urban sprawl. So it's so easy to forget that there are successes. Now, I was quite interested in Don's comment about the difference between rural and city, right? So in city, we have populations and it looks very much more dramatic when you can say that we had 18,000 people respond to that survey. But what you might want to do, Grit, is to do a sort of a survey of your own area. You've been doing great jobs attending all of those meetings, right? So now maybe the next thing is to work on the people in your municipality as well as the politicians. Anyway, it's been great here. Thanks so much for putting this on. It's been a very good, lovely session again. Thank you. Thanks, Don.
Thanks so much for that, Anne. That's a very good point. I do know for sure in small towns, it might not seem like there's a lot of people, but when everyone knows everyone, not a lot of people can do a lot. So that's a very good point. I don't know if you still have your hand up or not, Grit. So
Yes, I do.
You do, you go right ahead. Yeah.
Yes, I do. And thank you very much, Anne, for your comments, because one of the things I have done over the past 6 years through my Facebook page and my website, which is all 100% paid for by me and my husband. We have no fees to pay or join, and I have quite a following in Northumberland County, much more than a lot of other reputable organizations. So I actually think that we have some momentum in our county, and we need help because we have developers that are trying to come into a totally 100% rural township and bring in urban development in an area that does not even meet any planning principles at all. So they're looking for an MZO. Well, they came forward with an MZO proposal to council. Council voted it down 3-2. But not even 3 weeks later, I had the president and the vice president of Land Lab show up on my porch. I invited them after they phoned, yes. And I said, sure, come and talk to me. And they tried to convince me that a modified MZO could be the ticket. And I went, no, no, no. So how do we stop this machine? How do we stop it? I don't even know. I'm working so hard on my local level. I'm in the Watershed magazine. We've got Blue Dot organization on our side. Everybody, how do we stop this frickin' bulldozer machine that's coming in to just plow over all of our rural lands and take away all our farmlands and our rural lifestyle? I want to know how to stop it. And I think we all need to get together and make it happen together.
We very much appreciate your passion, Grit. I can see Don with his hand up and a smile on his face because I know he agrees and appreciates what you're doing too. So Don, you go right ahead.
Yeah, you got it right, Steph. And you got it right, Grit. You're doing what you should be doing. And if you got them on your front porch, they're scared. They're scared of you. They're scared of the influence that you have. And it shows that people who stand up for justice, for the environment, for what is really a public good, they get public support. And that frightens those who want to come and do damage to it. And we've had the same experiences here. The only suggestion I might make in terms of your situation, you're probably doing this already, is probably you have at least a portion of your population in your county that isn't anything, doesn't have anything to do with the internet or the Facebook, that they have other ways of communicating, and they may have influence, because quite often in my experience in council is the councillors, once they get elected, they don't change much. The ideas that they came with are the ones that are set in concrete in their skulls, and they're here for 20 years or 25 years, and they keep saying the same things because the people that elected them in the first place were the ones that they continue to listen to, even though there's only a handful of them left. So you may find that there's ways of getting at that. And it sounds like you're doing all the right things. So thanks so much for joining us tonight. It's been a real useful experience to have your experience shared with us. And I'm sure there's ways that we can work together on this issue and others that are, because this is MZOs or something that are happening across the province, and we are trying to pay attention to what's happening to those. And in almost all cases, they are bad news that is being forced down people's throats by the use of a tool that prevents normal public consultation, prevents normal environmental assessment, prevents normal processes and planning, and just overrides everything and says, the province has decided, Mr. Ford and his cabinet have made the decision, and you people all get out of the way. And it sounds like you're doing some very good work there. So congratulations.
Can I add one more comment to that?
Of course.
Thank you. Because we have a council in Alnwick-Haldeman. 4 out of 5 members on council right now are self-appointed. We don't even have an elected council. So I don't know if you can even appreciate that, the magnitude of that, but that is enormous. And we have a deputy mayor that got moved into the mayor's position, and she's become a dictator. So that's what we are dealing with in our township. And it's even worse beyond that. And I won't go into it, but I want you to understand that that is what's happening in local politics, and it is destroying the fabric of our province.
Great. Phil?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not sure about the circumstances by which you ended up having all these appointed council. Were they just acclaimed? A lot of them?
No.
Oh, it was others resigned or ran for some other office and they were appointed?
No. So what happened? Number one, a council member died. So they went through the process. They had 3 options. They could appoint through a process of putting in a resume, or they could revert to the first person that won in the last election. The mayor didn't want that, so that didn't work. And the third one was to have a by-election. So they opted for number 1, to elect a person or appoint a person through an interview process. And that was good. That worked out well. There were 6 people that applied, and a decent person got appointed. So that was great. The second one happened after our mayor stepped down. And that was just right before the pandemic happened in February of 2020. Mayor stepped down, opened up the mayor's position, elected, deputy mayor's position, elected, and a councillor position, elected. So 3 positions opened up. And I raised the argument that they should have had a by-election. And the argument was, well, a by-election would cost us this and this. And I said, no, it wouldn't cost you that much because we're doing electronic elections in our township. So who are you kidding? So it wouldn't have cost the 40,000 plus or whatever. So that was the argument I brought forward. So nevertheless, it was still 4 persons that appointed themselves all within our council. So we have 4 people out of 5 on our council that are self-appointed within themselves. And I find that really, really unacceptable. And I raised it to all of our council members. And one of the council members, who happens to be the deputy mayor now, she actually came out and said, in hindsight, I agree with you. Great, that's huge. But so what? Where does it leave us? Nowhere. Nevertheless, doesn't matter. That's the whole thing of this. But we have a council that is not elected, and they're making the decisions in our township. And I struggle with that. I've raised many, many official complaints to the Integrity Commissioner, to the Ontario Ombudsman, where I had an open file for over 8 months. Yes. And they addressed a lot of issues with the township. But it shouldn't have to come to that. I mean, it's so stupid that we are dealing with this. I don't even know where to go from here. So that's where I'm hoping we can find some way to get together as a group and make something happen positive. I don't know where to go. That's it. Sorry.
No, that's totally okay. And your concern is very much understood and appreciated. I believe Dawn would like to speak to this again. He's always got some good thoughts. There were a couple of suggestions made in the chat as well for you, Grit. If you didn't see them, people you can reach out to, but I can also send that to you in a separate email. I will let Dawn speak to it. Yeah, sure. I'll let Dawn speak to it now though, because he knows much more than I do, and he always got some golden ideas. So here we go.
Perfect.
I mainly just wanted to say that we're almost 2.5 hours into this, and we're probably at a point that we should wrap up. It's been really helpful. All the participants, I particularly appreciate those who hung in this far, but most of our viewers have left some time ago. So that's probably a signal that we should wrap up.
Yeah, I understand that. And we were
we've been
heading in that direction as well.
And
yeah.
I know we've lost Hassan already. Thank you for